using that as a subject. But instead, I want to go back and talk about an earlier event that occurred in the life of David, and that is when he actually became the king of Israel. And he became the king of Israel after Saul, who was the first king of Israel, and his son Jonathan were both killed in battle at Mount Gilboa. It's a sad story in many respects, just because of the pathos that we find in David's recognition of their lives and of their deaths. If you go back and you read that story, which is found in the 2nd chapter of 2 Samuel, if you go back and you read that story, you will find there a long poem or ode written to be sung, and it was written by David. When David got the news of the death of his king and of his best friend. It seems only natural to me that David, who was a songwriter and who played an instrument and who probably sang most of his own compositions, it seems only natural that he should write some music to celebrate those two lives. The tribute that he wrote is much too long for our service today, but I will read just a few verses out of that tribute. David says, "Set up a monument, Israel, over the dead, on the high places of your slain. How the mighty have fallen. Do not tell it in Gath, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. Saul and Jonathan, so beautiful in life, that in their death they were not separated entirely. How the mighty have fallen, and the warriors of war perish." Death was an ever-present reality in the time of David. There were all of the natural causes of death that were much more prevalent then than they are today. Things such as disease, lack of modern medicine, lack of modern surgical procedures, lack of medical treatment processes, inadequate sterilization. The list could go on and on. You could be alive and healthy one day and dead the next. But one of the most common causes of death in David's time was war. Every spring, various tribal kings would call together their warriors, and they would go to war with other tribal kings. And the result would be death or dismemberment of many of the youngest and finest of their kingdom. It's sort of like the way that we inaugurate every fall with the first football game, you know, and we go out and we do battle on the football field. Well, in David's time, all of these little kingdoms were divided up primarily along tribal lines, and the king of the tribe would call for all of his young men to come, and we're going to war, and this year we're going to go to war with this tribe over here, and we're going to see if we can take a few acres of their land and capture a few hundred of their people, and we'll make slaves of them. Well, they usually paid a pretty high price for this kind of thing, but I mean, that was, you know, largely a part of their entertainment, I guess, that they would go out and fight each other. You may remember that it was David's decision one year to stay home from the wars of spring that got him into trouble with Bathsheba. His forces were fighting on the battlefield. He was bored. Bathsheba was beautiful, and her bath was right next door to the roof of David's palace, so that he could stand on his roof and look right down at her bath, and he could be attracted to her. And bingo, trouble ensued. bodies would be brought back from the battlefield if possible, and the women and the children would lament their dead. The people of David's day faced death on a daily basis. Now, what has led me to think about this subject today? And the thing that has led me to think about it is that we have a number of people in our congregation who are facing deaths in their family, probably in the fairly near future. Now, I'm not talking about this in order to be morbid. I want to talk about it from a pastoral point of view and make some suggestions about what I think the dead and the dying can teach us that we need to be listening to. Because we often these days do not hear what those people have to say to us. And the first thing that I would say is simply this. I think the dead and the dying teach us the importance of family stories. You ever think about that? It's sad. I think one of the sad things about our world today is that our families are so chaotic. Our families are often so broken by not one divorce or two divorces or even three divorces, but sometimes even more than 4 divorces. It's hard if you were a child in a family like that and you had gone through 4 different sets of extended family members. It's hard to develop any kind of affection for all of those people that you may be exposed to over time. In fact, I think that one of the things that happens very often with young people today is that they simply quit investing themselves in those families because they have no idea how long the family will actually last. They quit thinking about the stories that they are hearing. I think that is a sad truth of our time. David told the story of Saul and Jonathan in song because that was the most natural way for him to tell their stories. He wrote what is called an ode, O-D-E, a story in song about the accomplishments of these 2 people that he loved very much. And I really believe that even though Saul tried to kill him on several occasions, I do believe that David never stopped loving Saul, his king. And he certainly never stopped loving Jonathan, the king's son. I think that as much as possible, when those who are living can retell their stories, they should be allowed to retell their stories. One of the sad things about my many, many trips from Florida, Central Florida, up to Southeast Georgia, where my grandparents, my paternal grandparents lived, my grandmother said on one occasion, "I love it when you come because you will sit and listen to me tell my stories." She needed to tell those stories because she was preparing her soul to face God. And she needed an opportunity to tell her stories and to pass those stories along to one of her grandchildren. In my case, it happened to be me. I have just always loved old people. I have always loved hearing their stories. I realize that sometimes those people who are getting very, very old may reach the place where they're no longer able to tell their stories. But we can always recite back to them some of the stories that they have told. And maybe if they're not able to speak so much anymore, they might at least give us a smile of recognition. That they remember that event that you're talking about. It was an event that was important to both them and to you. And I think that we need to remember that throughout the Bible, the dead were always honored with stories of their accomplishments in their lives. The second thing I think that the dead and the dying can teach us is that they encourage us to have faith. And the way that they encourage us to have faith is maybe not what you're exactly thinking about. They encourage us to have faith in the sense that they teach us that ultimately we have to trust God. And we have to trust their souls into the care of God. I spent 2 assignments in the Army chaplaincy as senior chaplain at a large Army medical center. And one of the saddest things that I saw happen, and it happened way more than I would ever like to see it happen, were people who would say things to the doctors like, I don't care what you have to do, just keep her alive. Just keep her on life support. Or keep him on life support. Now, very often these were people who were Christian people. They believed in the resurrection, and yet they were afraid to entrust the person that was dying into the care and the mercies of God. Because if I can control when a person actually dies, then that means that I'm in ultimate control. And if we have to let go and say to the doctors, I don't think that my mother would want to continue this kind of suffering, or my father would want to continue this kind of suffering. And I think it's time just to let that person go. That becomes a great expression of faith in God. That we believe that God will be merciful to them in the end. And what I often saw, and what I saw 100% of the time, is that ultimately all of those people who said, I don't care what you have to do, just keep them alive, they all lost that battle. They all lost that battle because death is the end, the natural end of this life. A third thing that I think, and none of these things I'm suggesting to you are, I don't have any copyright on them or anything like that. I've picked them up from a number of sources and events in my own life and ministry. We have to learn to accept the humanness of the dying and the dead. David could easily have recited the many sins of Saul against God and against himself. Remember, Saul tried to run him to ground and tried to kill him. And David could have held on to that experience and just been angry with Saul forever. But he chose not to. He chose not to. He buried those memories with Saul's death. Now, I have known children who carried their anger against a dead parent or against a dying sibling to their own graves. You probably have experienced some of that kind of thing yourself. Sadly, as one noted psychologist said, death may end a life, but it does not end a relationship. As long as you live, you will carry with you all of the relationships of your life, both the positive ones and the painful ones. Painful living relationships seldom end with death. The pain simply finds other ways of affecting our lives. Think about that. The pain of painful relationships is never lost to us. And if we don't process it properly, then it just comes out in some different and even more destructive ways. Because for good or ill, we make choices about what we allow to continue to control our lives. If we can choose to remain angry with a dead parent or sibling, we can choose to forgive them and then go on with the business of our own lives. Remember the wonderful examples of Jesus on the cross and Stephen at his stoning in Jerusalem? Both of them said exactly the same words. Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. They forgave even those who murdered them. But this is a prayer that we cannot utter unless we are willing to forgive those who may have hurt us very badly. I think we also need to learn to allow the beautiful rituals of our faith to comfort our own souls as the death of a parent or a loved one draws near. If you go to the part of your prayer book about the visitation of the sick, it will actually give you a number of psalms that can be read for the comfort of the dying and for your own comfort as you celebrate the death of a dying person with you. Psalms like 20, 27, 42, 91, 121, 146. I'll send those out on emails this next week. And I'll tell you the page number in your prayer book where you can find those psalms listed. And there is nothing that you can do, I promise you, that will be more comforting to your own soul and more comforting to the soul of the person who's dying, even if you think they can't hear you, because they can, than to just sit quietly by their bed and read those psalms to them. You can always ask your priest to pray the litany for the dying as your loved one passes from this life to the next. That too is a beautiful part of our prayer book tradition. You can go to the collects for the visitation of the sick in your prayer book. You can read those collects. You can read those brief prayers. Again, they will comfort your soul. You can always ask your priest to light a votive candle and to say a prayer on each anniversary of your loved one's death. We do that frequently here. But above all, and this is something that I've come to appreciate very, very much since becoming a liturgical Christian, we can remember the words of the Sanctus that we sing each Sunday. As we here join our worship with the worship of heaven. Remember these words. Therefore, with angels and archangels, and with all the company of heaven, we laud and magnify thy glorious name, evermore praising thee and saying, Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of thy glory. Just imagine when you sing that every Sunday, and this is really a part of our tradition. I'm not making this up. Think of someone that you love and who meant everything to you in their life. And they're gone from this earth now, but they're in heaven worshiping God and singing the Sanctus, holy, 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 because the book of the Revelation says that we're singing that. And we're down here, and we're singing the same words. Just imagine them standing next to you and singing those words. I think one of the most glorious homegoings I ever witnessed as a hospital chaplain was in the hospital room of an elderly black or African-American woman who died at Eisenhower. The old black woman had been a woman of faith all of her life. Yet now she seemed restless, and she seemed reluctant to let go of this life and to join Christ in paradise. And she was in a comatose state. But you can tell sometimes people in a comatose state can still be agitated. And she just seemed very agitated. She tossed and she turned, and her face was twisted with pain. her children and I talked it over with the head nurse of the surgical intensive care unit. We got permission to bring a small tape recorder into her hospital room. And they brought some tapes of some gospel music. And they just put those on. We played those quietly enough. We didn't disturb other people in other units and so forth. But the longer those tapes played, the more relaxed she became. And you could just see all of the lines of pain and all of the whatever fears she might have had in her own life just disappear. And she slipped quietly from this life into the next life in the peace of God. And that's what we want for those people that we love. That's what we want for those people that we love. Not that we try to live out some kind of strange control needs that we have for fear of letting go of someone that we love. If I let them go, I'll never see them again. No, you know, if you believe your faith, you will. You know, you will. Just trust that. Trust God. And let those people go. And trust them to the care of God. Amen.
Amen.
Let's stand for the singing.